Call the special council meeting to order. It's 4 o'clock. The first thing on the agenda is fiscal year 2022-2023 budget discussion. Presentation of changes made to the proposed budget after the budget retreat, 4/21, 4/22. Oh, excuse me, Rhonda. I didn't see you walk up there. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, members of council. This certainly is a discussion. We wanted to follow up with all of you regarding the discussion and kind of outcome of the budget retreat and incorporate what we could into this budget. It definitely is a proposed budget, and we would like to hear from you because we certainly would like to have a consensus so that we can have first reading next week, and we want to kind of address as many needs as we possibly can. And as I refer to we or us and looking at this budget, I had it was definitely a group effort from staff, Lisa, in conjunction with all the department heads, and my staff were very instrumental in helping us kind of put all this together. So one of the big things that that I heard, and I believe most everybody heard at the retreat, is that we would like to move towards a $15 an hour minimum wage and provide some consistency among the departments, the public work departments. We worked towards that. We also had a significant number of payroll increases, individual increases, and we kind of wanted to evaluate those individually or by department and look and see what the needs were. So we identified some recommendations as far as that goes. We also, as this budget seems that every day it's a moving target and things change and estimates change. But we found some either missing items or some small corrections that we made from department to department that we incorporated into what I consider a pretty good final stab at this particular budget. This was more of a reallocation. Our revenues did not change. So there was no more money to go anywhere. We had some staff changes and basically a reallocation of some of the staff and some reduced expenses. We were able to meet some of the demand for the increase in pay rate and some of the compensation requests. What we ended up, I'll tell you a little bit about the details of how, because compensation and the pay rates are really the major change in this budget from our budget retreat. We had some folks at $13 an hour. We're trying to move those to 15 based on everything that, you know, I worked on a couple of different ways. We were able to get that number to $14.60. So we kind of standardized that across all departments. So some folks got a little more percentage from like 12% increase to some with a 6% increase as far as those hourly wage earners up to about 16 and a half, I think, dollars is where I made the cutoff. Everybody else fell into a 2% or 3% pool, depending on what department you were in. Obviously, we talked about public works folks and our public safety looking at a 3%, 2% for everybody else. The one thing that remained constant over throughout all departments is we held the department heads and division directors at 2%. So they are there. We talked to some of the department heads about their 3% pools, giving them a little bit of leeway and how they want to see that allocated, because they know who their good employees are and they know who their workers are, and not put them in a box as far as that goes. Certainly, I think Chief Waring and Chief Wright are able to operate within that. That wasn't what they wanted, but they're kind of being creative and trying to use that pool to the best of their ability. So that is pretty much what we did there. For hourly employees, that increase cost us about $80,000 in this year's budget. I'm doing it in 2 steps. July 1, we'll pay half of the step. January 1, we'll pay the other half. That saves us about 25% over the year. However, that loads next year's budget at about $100,000, excluding benefits and extras. So we have to kind of be aware of that. But I felt like that was kind of the only way we could do it and minimize the cost of this year's budget. Like I said, the remainder goes into the 3% pool or the 2% pool. We looked at the individual requests that I referred to. We looked at those. We identified approximately $25,000 that were allocated among 20 to 25 people and or collectively departments for some increases. Building inspections and maintenance seem to be the departments that battle the private industry as far as keeping their skill set is very much in demand in the private industry. So I know there's a lot of pressure on keeping wages, keeping the good employees and keeping wages at a competitive wage. We gave those department heads probably some leeway in determining who really kind of needs to get that and keep their positions. I know maintenance has had it opening for quite a while. And it apparently is one of the reasons I believe is that the pay rate is just not what they can get in private industry. And certainly maintenance is an area that we want to make sure we know what's happening there because they can save us money if he can't get the work done and we have to send vehicles out. That certainly costs us a lot more than what it should in that case. Public safety is still 3% pool like we talked about. I think what else? Those were the main changes that I made on the budget. We're still at $41,488,000 is where we are. I did, after all my changes and reallocation of some other payroll expenses, I think I was about $1,000 short, which I reduced the non-departmental category as a contingency. I reduced that amount to come up with that additional amount to balance the budget. Any particular questions about that?
Yeah, I've got one question. I know in budget retreat, we talked about trying to bring some of the employees up to a certain wage limit. I think we were talking about $15 or something like that. So these numbers that you've done here skewed out the personnel. Some of the low-level employees like the street department and the guys for park and recreation, what's the minimum you're going to bring to?
Under this scenario, 1460.
1460.
Yes, sir.
That's very good. I know
Mr.
we were
Brown,
talking about-
turn your mic on.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, that's good because I know we were talking about somewhere between $13 and $15, which makes us much more competitive. Because stopped in Walterboro at Wendy's today. I went to see my sister and got a sandwich, and they got a big sign up, so they're paying $13.60 to hire people coming in. So it's getting competitive out there. And then you've got the parentheses on the personnel increase at the top for administration, 46,219. How were you able to generate that?
We reduced or reallocated the assistant town administrator salary. We reduced half of that in that particular area and reallocated it in other areas. That was really only the way this got funded, frankly, without another revenue source.
Okay. Now, one other little question, personnel increase for building inspectors, 23,044. And the operational increase dropped about 11,500.
On building inspections.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Talked to Mr. Brown and he was able to reduce some like training line items, a lot of things online. We reduced some of his expenditure line items. And then the increases for his department are a lot of industry that he's trying to keep up with industry so he can keep his people.
Okay, that's all I have.
We, in addition to the 1460, we wanted to make it consistent across departments, Parks and Rec, and stormwater and streets, so that they're all starting salaries the same instead of having one or the other. So some departments, just because the math didn't work, did not get quite the increase. But
So if you hire somebody that's new coming in for the first time working the streets or Parks and Recreation, what percentage or what's their salary when they get hired per hour?
1360 is the lowest level. Now,
Okay.
some positions or some jobs probably start a little higher than that.
Okay.
But that's the lowest under this scenario.
Oh, that's great. Great. Okay.
Any other-
Rhonda, at the budget retreat, I think there was some discussion about the municipal court. There was a difference between what was requested and what was recommended, and I think it was going to cost one person in the court. Has that, if I got some documents yesterday from the clerk that I was trying to make sense of, but has that position been restored?
Yes, yes, it has. There were actually two positions, that one, and there was a missing one on my budget list for streets that was vacant. And so we counted for that as well. So yes, those are incorporated into this. Thing on the expenditure side. And I just kind of want to talk about revenues. I didn't spend any time on it. My projections, I still stand by. I am happy to report that we are almost at budget for business licenses as of now. So that was a big number, and not knowing how the state changes would affect it, it was making me a little nervous, but we're within, I think, $40,000, $50,000 of meeting our budget for this year. So at least that's one more item that's, not quite so uncertain. And we talked about at the budget retreat about using ARP funds, and I said this is what I would explain to the bonding companies if they ask about it. Had subsequent conversation with David Cheatwood, who is our financial advisor for First Tryon. He's here tonight, and he'll be, but he corrected me and said that that was probably not something they would look favorably on. So we might have to regroup and think about what we need to do. But that's why he's here, to kind of give you his point of view and talk about the TIF and some of that. Anything else on expenses or revenues?
I was just going to clarify, and that is because we have the $2.8 million included in what our revenues are for this year.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And of
Which
course,
are non-reoccurring, one-time
non-recurring,
money.
yeah. I welcome any of y'all to reach out to me, because like I say, I really would like to have an ordinance that we can have first reading of next week. So for lots of reasons, I can refocus my time on audit. But, so I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, David. You ready? This is David Cheatwood, who's going to explain to us what we can do and what we should not do. To keep from hurting our rating, and that's one thing we don't want to do, is hurt our rating.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for having me here today. Just quick background. I think most of you may know who I am or have seen me here before. I've served as the town's financial advisor since 2015. So again, we're your advisor. We sit on your side of the table. Our role is to provide advice on things like long-term financial and capital planning. And then if you have bond issuances to do, we shepherd you through that process as well. So as Rhonda mentioned, or at least Rhonda invited me here today to talk to you about two things, primarily on some factors to keep in mind as you look to finalize your fiscal 23 budget. So I want to go through that, and then also touch on, while I'm here in front of you, the upcoming borrowing for the infrastructure improvements in your Midtown TIF district. So I've got some information on that as well. But I wanted to start out with just the budget perspective here. And so I'm going to give you a few factors to keep in mind. They do center around the credit quality, or the perceived credit quality of the town from an outsider's perspective. So some of this is going to be based in some actual information that's out there from credit ratings. And then some of what I tell you will just be based on my experience working with other cities and towns across the state and what they're doing with the American Rescue Plan funds as well, some observations there. But to start out from a credit rating perspective, you may say, well, why do we care about a credit rating? What does that do for us? And so from a credit rating perspective, right now the town has two ratings from two different, or a rating from two different agencies, Moody's and Standard & Poor's. Those are two of the three primary rating agencies out there. Fitch is the third. You don't have a Fitch rating. A lot of entities don't have a Fitch rating, but you all have had that for a rating for at least, I think 14 years, going all the way back, maybe 15 years to when you issued general obligation bonds back in 07 or 08. We've since refinanced those. And then you issued some other debt in 2015 that carry a bond rating as well. And the reason you care about a bond rating is that is one of the primary factors in the interest rate on your outstanding debt, on your debt going forward too. Public market investors, mutual funds, insurance companies, they look to credit ratings to speak to the credit quality. They do their own work on you. They do their own credit workup. They look to these outside parties, these rating agencies, as validation of kind of what your credit ratings are there. And the higher rated you are, the lower interest rate you can get on your bonds. And that's why that's important to you. So especially if you're going to the market pretty soon, you do want to keep a keen eye on what your credit rating is. If you either don't have any debt outstanding, don't plan to issue any debt, you may not care as much about it, or at least in the near term, you don't care. But particularly with the town here, you are getting ready to issue debt potentially later this summer. That debt will be rated by Standard & Poor's. And so that credit rating is going to have a direct impact. So given the timing of that and the time of your budget, I thought it was good to point out a few factors here to keep in mind. So where is the town rated today? We've given you a chart there on the right-hand side of the page. The way Moody's rates bonds, AAA, I'm sure you're all, AAA is the best. The second best rating, they use a number and a letter, or letters and a number. So AA1 is second best overall rating, AA2, AA3, etc. S&P and Fitch do all numbers and then plus minuses. So AAA again is the best from S&P. AA plus is the best. That's our second best. That's the equivalent to AA1, etc. So right now the town is rated AA1 by Moody's and AA plus by S&P. So you have the second highest ratings possible out there. You've had those ratings in place for a number of years, so you've been really highly rated. Those ratings earlier this year were actually placed on negative watch by both entities because of the audit time. Earlier this year, you hadn't completed your fiscal 2020 audit, which was 12/31/20, and then you have a short year, your June 30/21 audit as well. Those Moody's and S&P have strict standards where if they don't receive it within a certain period of time, they're not getting that audited financial information. They put you on watch, and so you all were put on watch. You subsequently finished your 2020 audit. That was provided to them, and so that kind of puts you back in line to get that watch removed. So we've had, Rhonda, Lisa, and I, we've had conversations with both Moody's and S&P, provided them info. They obviously saw your 2020 audited financials, provided them some estimates on how your short year, June 30/21 would end up. And Moody's came back and affirmed, took you off negative watch, affirmed your AA1 rating. That was great news there. S&P is in the process of doing that now. We haven't heard from them yet. We expect to hear from them any day. And so we've had a number of conversations. They've requested a lot of information. And so expect to hear back from them today. I will note when we've had those conversations, we haven't really gotten much into the fiscal 23 information. We talked a little bit about ARPA funding, but a lot of that is based on kind of bringing them forward to where we are today, not so much from a projection basis. And so to the extent things change, certainly with S&P, when we go back to them later this summer for a rating on the bond, we'll have to tell them, all right, here's what our fiscal 23 budget is, here's how things are looking, or here's what we ultimately did on that. So I wanted to note a couple things from the Moody's report, since that's, again, several weeks old, so really, really recent here. Your strengths, as they note them, really strong tax base, obviously proximity to Charleston being in that larger MSA, a lot of great things happening in this area. They noted your healthy reserves and liquidity. So you've got a really good starting point. We talked a lot about kind of where those reserves were a couple of years ago at higher levels. You obviously dropped that down with the purchase of land back in 2020. That was in your audit. They saw that. We explained that. For situations like that, where you all have a one-time drop, pretty sizable drop, but it's for a capital need, that's pretty understandable. You all were in a really strong position. You decided to use some of that for a good opportunity to purchase land. They get that. They understand that. That was very explainable. Even with that drop, you were still at a very strong level there. And so again, they still note that your current level was a good, strong level. You have modest debt and fixed cost, another strength there. Challenges, they mentioned pension. Y'all don't really have control over your pension levels there. Below average income and wealth, Not so much, not in the state, but when they compare to national levels and other AA1 type peers, yes, it's a little bit lower. Normally you see the higher wealth level areas have higher credit ratings. So that's not really a knock. That's more of a comparison to other peers across the country there. And then you have some exposure to economically sensitive revenues. I want to point out the factors that they said could lead to a downgrade. If your reserves continue to drop, that's a negative. That could lead to a downgrade there. Obviously, if you go and issue a ton of debt, that's an issue. We did notify them of an upcoming debt issuance, so that was taken into account. And then if your tax base starts to erode. So pretty kind of standard things that would lead to a downgrade there. But when you look at both, what I wanted to do here is look at both. Beth, I think I lost it, but maybe if you just go forward one. So both Moody's and S&P, they are very clear cut on how they rate general obligation bond debt. And so they both have very specific, one calls them criteria, one calls them a methodology. Here are the different factors we take into account. Here's the weighting we assign to each factor. Here's your score. Depending on where your score is, that shows where you grade out on that credit rating spectrum. And then they have these below the line adjustments they can make. If a particular data point is really skewing it one way or the other, or there's something that the numbers aren't telling them, they have the wiggle room to adjust that credit rating or that scoring. I wanted to highlight what each of those factors are. If you go one other slide, they're pretty similar for both Moody's and S&P. For Moody's, they're looking at 30% of your overall credit rating is tied to your economy or tax base. They're looking purely at the size of your tax base, your market value per capita, and your wealth levels. Finances, they are primarily looking at your fund balance, both current and over a 5-year historical period. Is it going down? Is it going up? And then your cash balance levels, similarly spot level and historical change as well. From a management perspective, they look at what they call institutional framework, basically your relationship with the state. All entities in a given state have the same score for that. And then your operating history. Operating history is basically how close are your operating revenues to your operating expenditures each and every time. If you all are budgeting a certain level and then you have operating surpluses, in their mind, that's a positive. Your conservative budgeting or your revenues are outpacing your expenses, and vice versa. If your expenses are higher than your revenues operating, that's a negative. And then they look at your debt and pension levels as well. And I'll come back to this one if you go forward, but just to hit S&P real quick, they're looking at a lot of the same stuff: institutional framework, the local economy. They have a couple of different metrics or statistics they look at for that, but again, it's largely tax-based wealth levels. Financial measures, they're looking at your fund balance, they're looking at your annual revenues versus expenditures. Management's a big one for S&P. They look at certain criteria there and basically how effectively, not just Lisa's position, but from a counselor's perspective, how are y'all managing the town, both operationally, financially, and otherwise. And then they look at debt. So specifically, as y'all are looking at your budget and the use of looking at that chart that Rhonda had pulled up, your operating expenses of around 45 million, your operating revenues of around 42 million, and then using that around 2.8 million of American Rescue Plan funding to bridge that gap. When Rhonda told me that, my reaction was, and again, this is just me, I'd go straight to these. All right, how does that impact the credit rating? And particularly with y'all, because we're in the midst of talking to them and you have a bond issue coming up. So that's going to flow through a couple of things if you all ultimately did that. And I will say, I'm strictly here to give you advice, give you information. It is your decision as the governing body what you ultimately do there, but just want to give you all the facts out there. But if you go back to the Moody's one, where that is going to flow through is on the operating history is the big one. So when they're looking at operating revenues versus operating expenses, you all would have a mismatch, and that's something that they certainly take into account. Even though your budget is balanced with the use of that, they're seeing that for what it is. It's one-time revenue that's coming in to balance the budget there. It also would ultimately flow through potentially to your fund balance and cash balance levels, even though you're using that. Their immediate question is going to be, all right, what happens next year when that one time is gone? Are you going to use your fund balance again to effectively use that? I know you're not directly using your ARPA funding. I think it goes into your fund balance, and then you're appropriating fund balance to effectively balance the budget there. So it flows through there, and then similarly, it flows through on the S&P scoring system, both on the, if you go forward one more, Beth. Sorry if the financial measures, it goes through there. And then one other below the line factor I wanted to point out for S&P is that structural imbalance. So they don't have a specific one if you have, operating revenues versus expenses in a given year, but they have this below the line that if you have, and it's not just 1 year, you're going to, entities have years where expenses are higher than revenues and they've got to appropriate or use some fund balance. But it is looking at a pattern. It's looking at willingness to increase revenues to cover operating expenses. But that's a red flag to them if they don't see those matching up, or particularly a repeated pattern of that, or unwillingness to do that. So with all of this, if again, this proceeds and we talk to them again, I will say with S&P, and that's the one we'll get a rating on for the bond issue later, they may very well, if they go and affirm you today at the AA+, your current rating, they may look at this and say, all right, well, I didn't like what you did there. I've got to go and reevaluate, take these other factors into consideration, and I'm going to downgrade you a notch or two on that. And that downgrade, again, would have a direct impact on your interest rate on your upcoming bond deal. The quantity, the dollar amount, depends on how much you borrow, depends on how long a term you borrow it. But for your particular borrowing, you're looking at around $20 million. It would be about $200,000 total difference if you had a one notch lower rating. Generally, it's about 10 basis points, 0.1% for every notch you go lower on the rating spectrum. And so the actual dollar amount depends on ultimately how much you borrow. So that it would flow through, kind of have a direct impact on your borrowing potentially. And I wouldn't sit here and tell you you're absolutely going to get downgraded, but based on experience, I would say that increases the likelihood you get downgraded if you do that. And then on a going forward basis, if you all say, well, that's fine, we don't have any other debt, it doesn't impact your current debt. Your current debt is fixed rate to maturity, so you can get downgraded 5 notches. It doesn't change the current interest amount you're paying on that debt. So it's all for projected issuances. And if you all say, well, that's fine, we don't have any other borrowings for the next 5 years, so be it. Again, that's okay. I'm not here to tell you you have to govern to a rating agency. Again, I'm giving you the facts, what's out there, and how that can impact things. So that's more of the public market where you have the rating agencies, the public market investors. But banks, if you go and get a capital lease for vehicles or equipment, or you go and get a loan from something else, they're going to look at your credit quality too. Just like if you went and got a loan personally or a mortgage, they're going to dig in. What's your cash balance? What's essentially your operating history, revenues coming in, expenses going out, and they're going to grade you, give you a credit quality as well. So banks are doing the same thing. It's just not crystal clear like the public market, the rating agencies are doing there. So that's kind of from a rating agency perspective, factors to take into account. I will say just more from an observation standpoint, and we work with the majority of the cities and towns in the state, and certainly the larger ones. The ARPA funding, American Rescue Plan funding, has been a hot topic for close to a year now. What are we going to use that for? You obviously have your specific uses you can use that for. That was broadened a little bit with this revenue loss that the Treasury Department came out and said, all right, you can use it for revenue loss up to a certain amount. So a little bit more flexibility there. I will tell you I'm not aware of another entity that is using it from an operational side to cover operating expenses, which again, I know you may not be doing directly, but indirectly. The uses we're seeing are, one, for the one-time expenses. It can be on salaries, but the premium pay, things like that. I've seen a lot of that. And then I've seen a lot for capital. You have specific capital things that you can use it for that's out there. So we've seen that one-time capital use either directly if it's a specified use, or if you're able to capture it from that revenue loss calculation and effectively it goes into your fund balance, then using your fund balance for a one-time capital need, just like you use your fund balance for a one-time land purchase back in 2020. So that's largely what I'm seeing. I have not seen it again for operating expenses there. And so I wanted to note that. And then, just more generally, taking out ARPA funding for a second, we do see entities who budget the use of fund balance each and every year. That happens. And we see that normally, and I will go back to the credit rating side for a second. Where that is received well, or at least understood, is if you budget and you've got that history, listen, we always conservatively budget and we understate our expenses, our revenues. We're conservative to the high side on expenses. And so we budget a fund balance. But if you look back over a certain number of years, every year where we've budgeted, we've either never had to use it, or sometimes we use it in a one-time thing if revenues didn't come in quite as much as we expected. And so you build that credibility with them because you have that history of doing it. I don't know this for sure, but I don't think that's been the case where y'all have historically budgeted appropriation or appropriated fund balance. Maybe you have there. I would say
Yeah.
this is, if you do this, a larger amount than you've done in the past there. And so I don't think you have the history to say, well, yeah, we do this every year, we'll come in over. I also don't know that, the level of conservatism that's in the revenue numbers that Rhonda's projecting there. But I did want to note that it's not like we never see an appropriation of fund balance. We just see it normally due to really conservative budgeting. And the plan, even though it's not in the budgets, maybe not said, is we hope we don't have to use that, or we don't plan to use that. So I note that out there, and I would say just kind of looking back from a revenue perspective, and this is just more general financial planning we look at, especially in this environment with the rampant inflation. You see expenses starting to grow faster than operating expenses start to grow faster than operating revenues. And that's just when your operating revenues aren't enough to catch up, that's obviously where the structural imbalance hits. And that's hard to kind of get over that hump sometimes, especially once it starts. But, that's where the tougher questions, like we either have to cut expenses or we have to raise revenues. There's only two ways to do it. I guess there's the third of using fund balance to cover that. But again, that's a one-time thing. And so I would say, again, obviously your decision on what you do there, but wanted to flag that for you and let you know potential ramifications, implications if you do that. Again, not saying you will get downgraded, but I think that'll be something that gets taken into account and could affect your borrowing cost now with this upcoming bond deal. And I don't think you have really a whole lot else planned near term after that, but anything else you did, it could affect that a bank or public market perspective.
David, can I ask you a question, please?
Yes, sir.
You mentioned $200,000. $200,000 of what?
Of additional interest you would pay over the life of the deal. So that's how much additional interest you would pay, estimated, of course, but over what you would have based on a one-notch decline in your credit rating. And so it's pretty much so if you went 2 notches, it would roughly be 400,000, et cetera. And so that's, again, based on an estimate of how much more an investor will demand an interest rate for a lower rated bond. That answers your question.
Yes, and if we were to look at avenues to offset that, and of course, that's increasing revenues and fees, taxes, or projections on what we've got income coming in. How much of that do we need? Is that the fact that we're willing to do it? The fact that we have done it? What brings that into play to not be downgraded?
I think if you had if your budget showed just a balanced budget without the use of that, then that pretty quickly and easily checks that box. If from a rating agency perspective, that you have a balanced budget, you have projected operating revenues to cover your operating expenses. If you did appropriate fund balance for that, I think the quantity would come into play. How much? I mean, if it's 200,000, 500,000, if it's a relatively minimal amount on a $45 million budget, again, I think that's not a big deal. But if it's several $1 million, we would, I think, have to say there's, whether this is true, is there a lot of conservatism in there? We're ultra conservative on our revenues and expenditures. And so we don't plan on using all that, but that's what we have in there. And so that sort of commentary would potentially satisfy, placate the rating agencies if you had that. But if the answer was no, I mean, I think we're pretty on our projected revenues and expenses. Yeah, we may get a little bit of a benefit. Instead of 2.8 million, we may only use 2.5. I don't think that'll get it, because again, it gets back to not just the deficiency there from an operating perspective, but the willingness to increase, whether it be a tax rate or other rates or fees, in order to cover it, because the immediate next question is, well, what are you going to do next year when you don't have that one-time kind of revenue shot in the arm to cover this? And that comes up, I will say, with the ARPA funding too, when we say, hey, you're going to use it for capital project or some other new program. And the question is, well, is that program, that one-time use of revenue for a program, is that then going to cause you to have an ongoing operating expense tied to this new program? Like, those are things they're interested in, because a lot of people get the one-time money in, say, great, we're going to use it for this, and then that increases their operating expenses going forward. So you have to have a plan to pay for that as well. But the capital items are easy answers to that, use for the use of those funds. And I know I maybe went on a tangent there, but that's what they're looking at. Those are the types of responses that would be viewed favorably. But if it's again, we just don't have enough revenue, we don't want to increase the tax rate to cover it, we're going to use this, then that's where it's not viewed favorably. Thank you.
David, we have done I'm glad you brought up that many entities, many municipalities use fund balance as a placeholder in their budgeting. We did that regularly, at least 3 years in a row, if not 4, under 2 administrators ago, which I'm sure you worked with Captain Colin Martin, and that was just what we did.
Right.
I don't think it was anywhere near 2.8 million, but it was a significant amount of the budget showed money coming from fund balance to balance the budget. And as you said, what often happens if you're conservative in your revenue projections and your department heads and division heads come in under budget like they're kind of supposed to, at least a couple of years, we not only did we not use any of the fund balance, we increased the fund balance, increased the surplus. So is there a threshold? I mean, if we budgeted $500,000 from fund balance and we spend zero at the end of the year, we have spent 0 or 100,000 of it. Is that, I mean, that's never affected our credit rating before.
That's right. Yeah, you're exactly right on all those points. And again, going back, other entities do just that. They appropriate. And again, I would think most say we either hope, don't plan to use that, or if we do, it maybe is not as much of that. But that goes back to that history of doing it. And so there's not a bright line. If you do this amount, then it's, you're going to be red flag, but it really just gets to does it get to a certain level of magnitude where you can't really say, well, yeah, revenues we're really conservative. They're going to outpace, and we think it's not going to be that amount. It's going to be a much lesser amount. So if it gets really high, and that's a generic term, obviously. But if y'all had that past history, again, I don't have those figures pulled up of what you've done in the years past, but if it was in line with that, then I think, again, that's a good explanation.
If I'm not mistaken, we did it for the 2019, 18, and maybe 2020 years. But I know it wasn't 2.8 million, but it maybe one of those years we actually used some of fund balance. The projections were not as conservative as they needed to be, but another year I think it was a wash. We used none, but one year where we budgeted several $100,000, if not $500,000 in fund balance to balance the budget. Fund balance actually went up. Revenues exceeded projections by that much.
And we literally just had a call yesterday with the rating agencies, and we included a chart because this was an entity, and it was a North Carolina entity, but the same thought process. They appropriate fund balance every year as part of their budget. We had a chart that said, here's how much we appropriated each year, and here's how much we ultimately used. And they had a couple of years where they never had a year where they used the total amount. So over 5 years, they used a certain amount 2 years, but in 5 years they added to it. And then, so that gets back to that. Hey, we built the credibility. Yeah, we're showing use of fund balance here, but we've rarely had to use it. Or if we did have to use it, and this is also a little bit of a difference. we've used it because we have a capital item in here to cover it. And so we are appropriating fund balance to cover $1 million fire truck. That's why we have it in there. So we're using that fund balance. And that is a little bit of a distinction because in that number, you all don't have any capital. And so if you had capital, going back to what you did in 2020, that's with the land purchase, that is explainable. We've budgeted fund balance. We plan to use it. If we don't have to use it all, great. And then, so I think that's a little bit of a difference. And again, not having all your prior budgets in front of you, I don't know if for all of those you had, I'm assuming you had some level of capital.
We did.
In each of those. So that's a little bit of.
We have fire trucks, police cars, that sort of thing, and all of those budgets.
And so that's, I guess the distinction is the amount this year and the fact that there's no capital in your budget. And so if those matched up, the one-time capital purchases needs are more easily explainable versus just.
And I'm assuming, I may be wrong, I'm assuming that audited numbers are what these rating agencies are more focused on than what we put in the budget, or?
Absolutely. They focus on the audit. Those are the real ones. They realize most entities like you all are conservative in your budgeting. So just because you budget fund balance, they're not going to say, whoa, we're going to assume you've used all that and take you down. I think it's going to get more towards these more nebulous below the line, these management, these other factors about, well, again, going back to it's operating, you don't have capital in there. Well, what are you all going to do if the next year it's the same thing? Again, you don't have that one-time shot in the arm with the revenues. You're deferring your capital there. At some point, this is going to come home to roost. So what are you going to do on that? So I think that's more of the discussion, and that's why these agencies, while they have the very specific scoring, they still leave themselves wiggle room, because even if the numbers prove out, which are going to be based on audited numbers, they're still giving themselves room to say, well, wow, you've got this coming up. I need to take that into consideration. Or, there's unwillingness to kind of have revenues match expenses. That's something I want to take into account. So I think that's where it's likely to come up. Not so much in financials right now, because financials is looking back, but it's more from a management and from that kind of going forward structural imbalance below the line type factors.
We're now about 10 months, I guess, in 10 months since the last budget year ended. And as you said, we got put on the Moody's and S&P watch list for delayed audit. We're off of Moody's watch list. We're hoping to get off the other watch list. Are we in danger of being back on the Moody's list, and that we're 10 months from, we don't have an audit 10 months after the budget year ended?
You are not yet. The 2020 numbers satisfied them for now, and I have to go back and check. I think both entities have a 18-month firm line where if they don't have data within 18 months, then you start to get on that watch list. And so when we were in January of 2022, and their most recent audit was from December of 19, you were past so you were past that, and again, you've gotten a little leeway there. But once you gave them the 2020 numbers, you've got some, and a lot of people. So if you look at your June 30, a lot of entities are finishing their audit either December, January, February, and so there's still some entities that again aren't finished with their 21 audits either. So you're not alone in that. And particularly with all, when you're switching to a short year, there's some explanation, or a different fiscal year, you've got some explanation there. So you're not in danger of going right back on the watch list. I know Rhonda's working hard to finish that 21 audit up. And so I don't expect you to go back on the watch list, just give you the expected time.
My frustration is that if we had that audit, from talking to Rhonda and others, that it would in all likelihood show a fairly dramatic increase in our fund balance. And if we had, let's just say, $4 or $5 million more in our fund balance audited numbers than what we have now, we would certainly appreciate what you're telling us. I think we all understand everything you said. Most of us have been here a while. We remember when we got upgraded from that third level to the second level. I think it was in about 2013 when we partially used fund balance to pay off the note on the parking garage. And I would have thought that might have caused a decrease in our credit rating because we were lowering the fund balance, but it didn't. We actually, that's when we got the increase to the second level. So I'm very frustrated that we don't have, and therefore these credit rating companies don't have anywhere near current audited fund balance information, because I think it's a completely different conversation if we could show them an audited numbers $4 or $5 more million in fund balance.
Yeah, I do think we were able to speak to it a little bit, didn't have the numbers about what expectations were, the potential numbers were there. So some of that was noted, the expected increase in fund balance once the June 30 numbers are there. And then, I guess how y'all are obviously tracking through fiscal 22 matters as well. So some of that, I won't say it was all taken into consideration because we didn't have audited numbers, but it was relayed to them that the expectation was there that it would increase. Admittedly, though, there's some noise around when you switch your fiscal years, and you've got that now, that June 30, that short year, how much of that increase in fund balance is due to just you've got your revenues coming in during that year and not as much expenses going out. So there was some conversation on that. And honestly, not a lot of people don't switch their fiscal years a lot. So there's not a lot of things to go on to say, well, hey, it always happens like this. And so I think just going forward, having your 6 month, that new starting point of where we finished June 30, 21, and then obviously once you have a full 12-month audit, which, maybe 8-10 months from now on 22, that is going to almost kind of reset your starting point, because there is some of that noise around change fiscal year and how much of that is really due to strong outperformance of revenues versus expenses versus more of a cash flow timing. That's interesting to see.
Well, we're talking, we've got about almost $3 million that we're struggling with. And I heard you say that the credit rating agencies would look favorably if we had a willingness to raise taxes. Of course, that's the difference between economists and a glass tower and human beings paying their taxes. But would they also look favorably on us just cutting our budget by 2.8 million? Just not spending.
What at the end of the day, they're looking for structural balance, but they're also, looking, are you providing a, high level service? Are you keeping employees happy? Like if you have to sacrifice certain things to cut that budget, and then you lose people or services because of that. And then, so they look at that kind of follow through effect. Are you losing people? And then the people that come in, maybe that, causes, whether it's management, other employees, service to suffer, and then people get frustrated and they leave town. So there's that follow through effect that they'll play out.
So if we really wanted to maximize our credit rating, I mean, we've actually capped under state law, but if we really wanted to maximize our credit rating, maybe get to the top, I mean, we just increase taxes as much as we possibly could and to give more services. The economists in New York City would think that was wonderful.
Yes, and that's where one of the things I said at the start is you don't want to govern to a rating agency.
No doubt.
We see that a lot in water and sewer entities. You could be AAA across the board if you had sky high rates, a ton of cash, and a ton of coverage over your debt. A lot of entities are AAA, and that's what they want to, because they have big borrowing needs and they want to see that positive impact on their interest rate and lower debt service. Others say, listen, I'm okay being mid AA. If that means lower rates and everything else. And so again, that's up to each governing body, and things are, just to point out, I'm here just to give you the information. And also, you've gotten to that level. You worked hard to kind of get to that second highest rating. And so do you want to fall back? If potentially, if so, again, that is up to the body to do that.
I personally think we I think that'll get us in trouble. We were down to nothing in our fund balance after we bought that property. I think we should have bought the property, but and I know Bill totally disagrees with me on this, but we need a tax increase. And we need that, and we can get, with a few other things we're looking at, we can get a balanced budget and leave the fund balance alone. Use it for emergency solely until we see where we are a year from now. The tax increase lasts forever. I mean, I think that'll keep us from worrying about next year. We don't know where we could be next year. I mean, we don't know what our fund balance will be next year. We could be broke next year by using that fund balance. When you start using the fund balance, my whole career with the town, which was a long, long time, we never balanced the budget with the fund balance. And we had a healthy fund balance, sometimes 18 million, sometimes 20 million, and we weren't near as big as we are today. But our mayor never let us use that fund balance for balancing the budget, he and our administrator. And now when I was on council, we did. Maybe a couple of years out of 8 years. But our administrator didn't like doing it, and now our mayor didn't like doing it. But Bill's gonna do anything to keep from raising taxes. And sometimes you just gotta raise taxes. Now, that doesn't make a lot of citizens happy. A bunch of citizens don't mind. I mean, because I've talked to a lot of them, and they said, you gotta do what you gotta do to keep our citizens happy with the services we provide, like you said earlier. And you just can't stop providing raises and stuff to your employees. Or like you said, they'll leave you. I mean, McDonald's is paying more money than we paying our people in public works. And we were hoping we could catch up with them at this year's budget. We didn't come close. And we still, $2.8 million in the hole. And so because your feelings get in the way, or you're scared, like Bill, you won't ever get where you need to be. We raised taxes. I think the last year I was on council, or the second to the last year, we raised taxes. When Terry was on council, we agreed to, the first time he was on council, we agreed to raise taxes 2 years in a row. Council raised them the first year and they chickened out the second year. Now, nobody got beat because they raised taxes. But because the citizens of the town understood, if the citizens of the town knew where we were right now financially, they would be upset, the majority. Nobody would get beat because of a tax increase. And, sometimes you got to do hard things, but everybody sitting up here at this table took an oath of office to do what was right for the town, not to do what was right for them. So if anybody's not voting for a tax increase because they're scared to go get beat, they ought to quit council right now. That's not why you're here. You're here to try to do the right thing for the town. And we just at a low place. We have never done a budget and accepted the budget like we accepted this one without voting on it. $2.8 million out of balance, with no way to get it in balance without a tax increase. Because if we take it out of fund balance this time, it might not happen like Bill says. And we'll end up with more money in the fund balance next year. Because we cutting it to the bone this year for our department heads and division directors to think that they're going to come in way under budget next year. Everybody will probably finish over budget because we cut them to the bone. And these people that were working for us accepted that with a smile on their face after we told them where we were. They weren't happy about it, but they didn't let us know. So I'm not looking for any big fund balance next year. But we're lucky we got a fund balance this year. But last year in the budget, they pretty well got what they wanted. This year, they didn't get anything close to what they wanted. So next year, they're gonna be wanting to try to catch up. We didn't buy 10 cruisers we needed this year. Next year, that's not gonna go away. The police chief's gonna say he needs 20. Because we try to buy 10 a year. So we're not gonna have any large fund balance next year. We're gonna be, if we break even, we'll be lucky. But if we raise taxes to try to get some of this 2.8 million, if not all of it, we're gonna be doing the wrong thing. Because there's no other revenue to get. And I'm, you know, you've explained it to me where I understand we can't use the American Rescue money. I mean, because that will send the interest higher. And, you know, there's all kind of ways we can do it to send the interest higher. But we obligated to this TIF. I mean, we're obligated to it where if we don't do it, it's going to cost us money. And it's just, I mean, it's a no-brainer to me what we got to do. And the tax increase, you know, I've gone over with Rhonda, it's not that much money to anybody that they can't afford it. And I just think that's the way for us to go. And Rhonda can tell us exactly how much money it is. I mean, once we tell her how much we want to raise it. But I just think that's the way we ought to go, and this will get us to that 2.8 faster than any way we can get there. Other than taking out the fund balance, which I just think that's the wrong way to go. Because that's really guessing, because we don't know where that'll put us next year. We don't know what kind of fund balance we'll have next year. But I just agree with Bill, we're not gonna have a big one.
Mr. Cheatwood. This is probably an ignorant question, so forgive me. But would land sales count as a one-time funding stream if you were to budget that into your budget? Or is that kind of a softer feel than using ARPA funds? Not saying we have $2.8 million of land, but I'm just thinking of solutions.
I think it would be viewed the same way. You know, they generally classify one-time revenue, and so that would maybe. So I think it would be viewed the same.
Okay. And then one other question. Our debt kind of liability, is there a threshold where you would lower your rating based on a certain percentage? I know based on our revenues, we're about just under 3.5% of our expenditures are debt service. Is there some magical threshold that changes your rating?
There's not a firm, it's kind of one of those, the debt level is one of the factors they take into account, one of many as it went through. There's not one that I know S&P looks at is the debt service as a percentage of your operating expenses, basically how much of your budget is for debt service, but you really don't see their eyebrows start to raise until you get to 15%. So y'all are well below that. And that's, you know, one of the things Moody's noted is you do have relatively low debt levels right now. And even if you add on 20 million, still relatively low.
David, but just so I'm straight, and so I hope everybody here is straight and those watching online, the rating agencies that we're looking at, I mean, at this point in time, we've used $2.8 million of ARP funds, and we've spent no capital. So my assumption is that when the rating agencies look at us, they're not looking at us as being $2.8 million in the hole. They're looking at us being $5 million in the hole on a budget because we haven't spent, that's a question, because we haven't spent it off $4 million, whatever the number is, because we spent nothing on capital, and you can't go without spending something on capital. So am I viewing that correctly?
Yes, for the most part. I mean, I don't think they would say, all right, you didn't do any capital and you used 2 million, so I'm stacking those two on top. I think what and that's really how much you're in the hole. I think they would say, because they don't know inside and out how necessary is all of that capital. Are those wish list items, or do you have to have them? So they don't know that level of detail, but I think they would look at it and say, you're not doing any capital and you're using that, you're a big town in a growing area have to have capital, so you're not doing anything. So we're going to assume you're deferring a lot on that. And so, yeah, I don't think they would get into the weeds and maybe go to a particular number and kind of say you're X plus Y, but they would say, again, getting back to those below the line kind of more management type factors, you're not keeping up with your needs, and you're using that one time for expenses, operating expenses. Thank you. Do have one other topic that I can go through that's somewhat related to this, but I don't know, Lisa, if you want me to do that now, or if there's any other questions on this one, I'm happy to.
Yes, if there are no other questions about this particular part of it, David's going to move on into the TIF. Y'all are okay with that?
Sorry, Beth, I'm gonna have to call on you again. Go to the couple slides ahead or pages ahead. Yeah, that one would be great to start. So, since I was coming to talk to you about just from the budgeting side, you've got this upcoming TIF that's borrowing for the TIF infrastructure needs, and so we're kind of pretty primed and ready to go. Once your June 30, 21 audit is done, I think we can kind of kick this financing into high gear here. Y'all obviously approved your redevelopment plan and the ordinance creating the TIF, and issuing bonds as well. And so I wanted to give you an update because if you've been following, and I'm sure you've seen it in some form or fashion, interest rates a lot higher today than they were back in November, December. So with that, the numbers have changed on what that debt is going to cost. And so wanted to walk through and just give you a heads up on, this is not for fiscal 23 budget year, but it does get back to that longer term planning. Heads up, a couple years down the road, there may be a situation where absent some things that could correct it, where you may have to supplement from other available funds, supplement your tax increment revenues within this to pay the debt service. And so bear with me as I go through just kind of the slow build up as to how the numbers work. But you've got $25 million of debt that you're authorized to issue under your redevelopment plan. That's what you said you could issue up to. The initial plan has been to do an initial tranche of $20 million and then do a follow-up tranche of issuance of $5 million at some point down the road. We've assumed to do that in fiscal year 2026, so roughly 3 years from now, 3 or 4 years. The specific projects you've identified to fund with that 20 million, Maple Street's the big one there, some developer infrastructure the developers putting in payment for acquisition of those, coroner's office for the county, some school district projects, and then later on in that second tranche, an expansion to Cedar Street and some drainage and parking improvements. So that's that list that's been identified to this point that you would fund out of your debt. If you go to the next one, so how do you pay for that? The plan, the goal is that the tax increment revenues generated within the district cover the debt service on the bonds. And so you have set your initial base value, your assessed value in that TIF district. And so as it grows, that's what generates the increment to pay the debt service. The biggest shot in the arm or shots in the arm are going to come from the specific development in that Midtown project there. And so these are the list of projects that the developers provided the town. Their estimated development costs, they're all 6% type properties. And so again, all that, those are just the numbers that factor in. We've discounted those values that they've given us just to be conservative by 20%. That's what's flowing through our model. These are screenshots from a model we have to look at different scenarios out there. And they've given us when they expect that to be placed in service. And so that placed in year in service column dictates when your revenues are going to be realized. And so to take an example, if the apartments are placed in service by December 1 of 2035, that's going to go on your tax bill in the fall of 26. And you will realize those revenues. They will pay their property tax bill in, let's call it January of 27, fiscal year 27. So when you see placed in service in 25, you don't get your revenues in 25, you get them in that year in service is calendar year. You're going to get them to one full fiscal year later, but fiscal year 2027 in that case. So that's the math and how those start to roll up in there going forward. In addition to that specific development, you're going to have other improvements in the TIF district. You just haven't specifically identified them yet. You won't necessarily know what they are. So we've assumed you're going to have additional growth in that by 1% of your base value. That's going to grow as well and create additional incremental revenues there. So in addition to those specified projects, you're going to have other revenues coming in. We think that 1% growth is conservative. I'll talk about that in a couple of slides as well. So that's the investment coming in. From a revenue perspective, what does that generate? If you go to the next slide and start the numbers, hopefully you can see it on your screen. Maybe that below that. So how we're looking at that is we are assuming, again, those great. So we're looking at the current assessed values. That baseline was set right around $12.5 million. That's going to grow by about 1%. That's our assumption going forward. So just to skip all the numbers in the middle, we're assuming the current millage rate for the town, 59.5 mils, the current county rate. From a school district side, pursuant to your intergovernmental agreement, you're capped at $1 million overall. So their millage rates aren't, and how they move aren't too material here. But that far right column, so not the specific Midtown development identified, but if the rest of your base grows by 1%, that generates on the far right hand column over time, gets up to 100,000, then 200, then 300. You can see how that grows. So that's real dollars that you have coming in, and that's on a 1% growth. If you go to the next slide, for the specific development that was identified, that far right column, obviously much bigger numbers. You're up to around 1.8, 1.9, $2 million. But you'll see it doesn't come in until fiscal 2026 is when we first start to see those, because if we went back to those placed in service dates, 2024 is the first time a project would be done and completed. And so you've got a couple of years where you don't have any revenues coming in from that development. Hopefully your base grows and you have a little bit of revenues coming in there. But it's pretty material revenue on that far right hand side. Going to the next page, so we've talked about revenue. And then on the debt service side, if you go and issue $20 million based on current rates, we refer to the TIC, that's the true interest cost. If someone says for a public market deal like this is, what's the interest rate? What's the single interest rate? We refer to the true interest cost. So right now, if you borrowed, you'd be about 3.83%. If you borrowed back in December, you would have been around 2.5%, maybe a touch lower. And that's just given how much rates have gone up. It's, I won't say it's unprecedented because we've seen it in certain periods of time before, but it's been a while when we've seen rates go up this fast, this quickly. And that's all or predominantly driven by the inflation and the concerns, and then the aggressive Fed action. I was driving today, I think the Fed took a 50 basis point increase in today's coming out of today's meeting, and they expect to continue to be aggressive going forward. So that has a follow-through effect on all the borrowing rates. So we've just seen total rates go up 1.5% at least over the last the first 4 months of the calendar year. So that's a higher number than it was before, and you'll see. This gets into a little bit of details, but I want to point it out. That far right-hand column under net debt service, you don't have any, or you won't have any out-of-pocket debt service in fiscal 23 or fiscal 24. You start to have some in fiscal 25. You may say, why is that? Bondholders are willing to pay you a premium more than 100 cents on the dollar for a $100 bond in the public market if you can give them an interest rate that's higher than the current market yield. That premium is noted at $2.5 million. And so under the TIF statutes in South Carolina, you have to use the premium to pay the debt service. So if you want $20 million in the bank and you get premium, then you've got to use the premium to pay the debt service. That actually works out really well here because we don't have a lot of revenues coming in early. We need that premium. So we're exhausting that roughly $2.5 million to pay your 23, 24, and part of your 2025 debt service. The reason that the increase in rates has impacted this is we actually had more premium earlier, which would carry you further out, but we don't have that. We don't have as much premium anymore. So you're going to have to start coming out of pocket to pay debt service in fiscal 25. You can see it's about $265 million based on estimates, then $1 million. And then once you start paying principal and interest of we do it on a level basis, and we structure that so when you have all of the new Midtown development done, and you've got that revenue coming in, you have enough to cover your debt service payments. So that's the current estimate of where you are on the 22 potential borrowing. The next page just shows you an estimate. If you borrowed in 2026, you're going to layer on another kind of $500,000 of debt service based on estimated interest rates. Plus, we've built in a cushion for higher rates at that point in time. Going ahead on the far right-hand side, you'll see that your total, sorry, one more slide ahead, you'll see your total debt service, your total out of pocket. If you issue $25 million in debt, it's going to be around $2.3 million per year. Steps up a little bit over time. This will go out roughly 20 years. So we get to the punchline, which is the last page here. Let's compare your revenues versus your expenses. And so we have the revenues coming in, which are the tax increment revenues that we just went through from your existing base, growth in your base, plus those developments. And then we've got your debt service going out, which is the combination of the two borrowings for 25 million. What I wanted to highlight were two columns. That column 8, which is called debt service coverage, that's simply revenues divided by debt service. You'll see some red flagged or orange flagged years there in fiscal year 25, 26, and 27. And then you're going to see a little bit over 1 times coverage. What that 1 times coverage means, your revenues are enough to cover your debt service projected. But you're short in those years in fiscal 25 through 27. And you'll see highlighted next to it the dollar amount that means. So it's 174,000 in fiscal 25, 860, and then 540. So all in, you're about 1.5 million short in the aggregate in those 3 years. If all of these projections are exactly as they are, I will tell you they're not going to be exactly as they are. There's going to be some differences in there based on your growth, but that we've got to make some assumptions on what that is. And so this is again, serving as kind of a heads up. You may have coming up in a few fiscal years a shortfall, and the way this would be structured from a security standpoint and sold to investors is we're pledging the tax increment revenues, and if we're ever short, if those are ever short, town council, subject to appropriation, because you can't say you're going to do it absolutely because that would count against your debt limit, but subject to appropriation during the budget year, you would say, all right, we're going to be short 174,000. I'm going to budget 174,000 from somewhere else to cover that shortfall and make the payment. So that's how that would work if that all came to fruition. Ways that doesn't come to fruition, if you go to the last slide, the development comes in at a higher cost. You know, again, we've got a 20% assumption, discounted assumption in there. So if it comes in higher, that's going to help. If it comes in earlier, that helps too, because the reason we're short in some of those years is because we're not going to realize the bulk of those revenues until fiscal year 2027, just given the timing of when things are done. If you are growing outside of the specific development that's identified, if you're growing by more than 1%, that's going to help. You're going to have more dollars coming in. If you don't do the subsequent $5 million, if we get a couple years out and say, I don't like where this is going, it's not coming in exactly, or maybe it is, let's not do that other 5 million, or let's wait until we for sure have it. So you can always wait on that second borrowing. If you increase your millage rates, if the county does, or if you all do, that's going to have a follow through effect. It doesn't on the school district side because you're capped at $1 million. Or if interest rates go down between now and the time you issue, that will help. Doesn't seem likely at the moment, but that could help. But those are all ways where that problem solves itself, but we don't know that yet. So we want to point it out that may be something down the road you're faced with. And so when you go, certainly before you issue the debt, you got to have the comfort level that you're willing to repay it and have the revenues to repay it, or will have the revenues. And so while the goal is that the tax increment revenues do it, there may be some years early on where you've got to come up with other revenues to do it. So again, just wanted to tack on to the primary reason while I had you, just give you some of that, because again, once the June 30, 21 audit's done, assuming everybody's on board, we would jumpstart that and could potentially issue it sometime this summer. And I'm happy to come back. I know it's a lot to digest here. I'm happy to come back ahead of that and give an update, but wanted to just at least put that out there.
Did I understand you correctly, David? We would not be issuing these, you would not recommend, or we would not be issuing these bonds until after we have the June 2021 audit?
Yes, just from an investor standpoint, they're going to want to see, we talked about when rating agencies would put you on watch. Investors, once you get over, once you get to this stage, they'll want to see what your June 30. So right now, again, their latest information is 12/31 of 2020. So we are getting to 18 months to where they don't have any new information, and that's pushing it from an investor standpoint. So they will want to see that June 30. So once we have that, again, we'll kind of kickstart the.
But we would still expect to be able to do it this summer?
Depending on when the audit is done, I think, we've been working to date. We collectively, there's a working group, your bond counsel, Hainsworth, Sinclair Boyd, has been working on putting the offering document together. You all have already approved your bond ordinance or adopted your bond ordinance. So there's no other approvals to happen. It's really just finalizing that offering document and getting the bonds rated by S&P. And with the kind of what we've done with S&P now, just for their general review, that would be a pretty quick process. So yes, I think we could, once that audit's ready, we could get to market pretty quickly.
Thank you.
Any questions on that? Great news I brought today.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, thanks, David. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Good report.
So we have executive session.
Okay, next thing on the agenda is a consideration of a resolution to amend the town of Somerville's organizational chart.
Mr. Mayor, if I could, I'd like to make a motion that we postpone discussion of this until the May 12th council meeting, solely to allow us to continue to focus on the financial issues that we've been discussing so far.
I'll second.
Okay, you all heard the motion in a second. All in favor of this, signify, any discussion? Not all in favor of this, signify by raising your right hand and vote aye.
Aye.
Opposed likewise. Ayes carry. Next thing on the agenda is executive session.
Mayor, I make a motion, we go into executive session, to discuss contractual, personnel, and legal matters, to receive legal advice and discussion, discuss implementation of franchise fees, receive legal advice and discuss financing of Midtown TIF, discuss personnel matters related to proposed employee compensation if needed.
Second. Can I second? Okay, there. Okay, all in favor, signify by raising your right hand, vote aye.
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 Opposed likewise. Ayes carry. We're going to executive session.